Okay, welcome everybody to the third video in our series on God and evil. And today what I want to talk about is something that goes in the academic literature under the name of skeptical theism. I'm going to have my own distinctive take on it though, as usual. So strap yourself in. It's going to be a bit of a rocky ride, slightly longer one too perhaps today. Let's see how we go. First, just a quick summary of where we are up to. I've introduced the problem of evil to you, the standard academic problem of evil, the so-called intellectual problem, which is the problem of reconciling the existence of an all-knowing, all-powerful, and perfectly good God with the existence of evil, certainly serious evil, in the world. We've looked at the main line of response to that, so-called, what I'm calling greater good theodicy, the idea that God is justified in permitting and perhaps sometimes even inflicting evils upon people in order that they should achieve spiritual growth, spiritual development. They should enjoy the blessing of free will and so on and so forth. And as you know, if you've read the earlier videos, inspired by Dostoevsky's Ivan Karamazov, I find this idea just unconscionable. Human lives and the lives of children in particular are simply not for sale to those theories or those worlds which can bid the most good for them. It's not on as far as I'm concerned. Okay, and that point was essentially, if you like to put it in somewhat more pedestrian terms, it's simply the point that the end does not justify the means. The end does not justify the means, not when the means, or indeed the incidental cost in certain versions of it, is really serious evil. Okay, and serious human suffering. I mean, there is a great truth in the idea that we can become wiser and sometimes better through suffering, but that truth is prostituted when it's turned into a defense or justification for inflicting or permitting the serious suffering. Okay, this point applies equally to whether we're dealing with the so-called logical version of the argument from evil, that is, the version which seeks to be logically decisive, or whether we're dealing with the so-called evidential or probabilistic version, which tries to show simply that the existence of God, though not logically inconsistent with evil, is nevertheless highly improbable, or at least more improbable than not, given the existence of evil. Both fail because both rely on the notion of a greater good. Okay. I think that will do to bring us back up to speed with where we are. Let's move on. Okay. Just bear with me a moment. Okay, now, I've said that the main theistic response to the argument from evil is the appeal to greater goods. And this may appear to omit the emphasis that is often put on free will, and which you might have expected to be something different from the appeal to greater goods. And but that's not so when you look at most of the academic literature. Although the free will defense is often, particularly as developed by a professor of philosophy by the name of Alvin Plantinga, although it's often developed in a way in which it's sort of sharply distinguished from so-called greater goods way of thinking, it actually, when you look at it in detail, and I argued this about Plantinga in chapter 1 of my book, A Frightening Love, which is in the notes to the first video, I think. It's just not the case. It's just a version of. He ultimately depends upon the idea that there are greater goods which are going to justify the evils that are entailed in the creation of the world, and that those greater goods just turns out that the free will and things which go along with free will, like developing a holy relationship with God, they are the specific greater goods involved. Now, you might think there is a genuine version of a version of the free will defense which is genuinely, significantly, substantially different from any kind of an appeal to greater goods, and that would be simply to say, well, hang on, don't blame God for evil in the world, blame us, blame we humans, we're responsible for it. And what about those things which we don't appear to be responsible for, like natural disasters and sickness, illness and death? Well, perhaps these were introduced into the world via the evil-free choices of other created beings who have free will. So blame the creatures, not the creator, might be the slogan. But of course that's immediately vulnerable to a fairly obvious objection, which is say, well, okay, but why does, well, you might also ask, why did God create it all? Okay, if he foresees all of this, then you get into arguments about whether free will is compatible with divine foresight and divine sovereignty and so forth. And I'm just going to set those arguments aside here. One can also ask why. He certainly knows what's going on now. I mean, we do, so I assume that he can. Okay. If he says he knows what's going on, why on earth does he not intervene? Okay, to save little children dying of terrible diseases or from being raped or murdered and so forth. I mean, we're expected to prevent it if we can. Why not God? And it's a lot easier for him to prevent it than for us. Okay. And once again, as I said before, it's no help to appeal to the greater goods argument. Okay, as I say, that's simply out of court as far as I'm concerned. Okay, let's move on. While greater goods are out of court, we can nevertheless make a distinction, one which in fact I introduced right back in the first video, between securing a greater good as a justification for evil versus avoiding a greater evil as a justification for permitting a lesser evil. Now, while, as I say, in my opinion, anti-theodicy, as I call it, the view that again, put it in the slogan, the end does not justify the means, at least in cases where the means involve serious evil, the means or the cost. While securing a greater good from in order to justify a lesser evil is unconscionable, it's not so obvious that we can be emphatic about the matter when it comes to permitting a lesser evil in order to avoid a greater evil. Now, at this point I want to be careful because the matter is subtle, and a lot of discussion of it by both philosophers of religion and moral philosophers is, frankly, subpar in its tone. There is real risk of something morally distasteful in these discussions, and I want to try and avoid that myself. And I may not, entirely avoid that. But I do think we can say that we can make the anti-theodicy argument stick, okay, without having to take a general stand one way or the other as to whether or not it's all right to avoid greater evils, to permit lesser evils in order to avoid a greater one. My own view is it's not for us to say, or for philosophers in general, to lay down the law about this to people who are in such horrendous situations. That's a whole different topic, okay? But I won't go into that now. If it's not for us philosophers to say, then it's not for us anti-theodicists to say. So as far as anti-theodicy goes, it's not entitled to the assumption that it's just unconscionable to countenance the idea that it could be all right to allow lesser evils in order to avoid greater ones. We can't just assume that in a way. I think we can just assume that it's unconscionable to permit serious lesser evils in order to secure greater goods. Okay. So, anti-theodicy is going to be non-committal. Now, if it is, then is not the following a logical possibility? That for each actual evil, there is some greater evil which would, by logical necessity, have occurred in the stead of the original evil, that is, the lesser evil, if the lesser evil had been prevented. If so, then God would be justified in allowing these lesser evils to avoid these greater evils. That would avoid the anti-theodical objection to greater goods and counter the logical argument. The logical version of the argument from evil against God. But then is this not also a logical possibility? We do not know that, or we cannot reasonably tell whether or not for each actual evil in the world there is some greater evil which would by logical necessity have occurred in the stead of the original evil. Or less, that is, the lesser evil, if the lesser evil had been prevented. But then we cannot justifiably assume that this scenario, call it the greater evil scenario, is less likely than not. Or as I shall put it for convenience, for all we can tell, the greater evil scenario is not unlikely. For all we can tell, it's not unlikely. But then the atheist is not entitled to assume it is unlikely. Thus the atheist avoids the anti-theodical objection to greater goods, okay, by switching to greater evils, and thus counters the evidential argument. Okay. Now, the theist has an idea in their defensive arsenal which they can apply here, and this is the idea of skeptical theism. Okay. The basic idea of skeptical theism is this. Compared to God at least, okay, we humans are so ignorant, our cognitive and epistemic powers are so puny that we are not in a position to know or to have a reasonable belief about not just the possibility of their existing justifying greater goods, because the context of the discussion in the main academic literature is about greater goods, as I say. We're not in a position to know or have reasonable belief about the likelihood of greater goods existing. Okay, all the discussion in the academic literature is mainly about whether it's reasonable to believe in these greater goods. Virtually no discussion of whether or not they would actually justify anything if they did exist. Okay, which is what I'm on about in the last video. But anyway, we're just explaining the mainstream view here. Okay, we are too ignorant to know or have reasonable belief about the likelihood of greater goods. Let's give an analogy here. Consider searching for life in space, okay? At least before the invention of, radio telescopy and so forth. Human beings confined like little ants crawling around on the surface of this planet on the edge of one particularly unimportant solar system, inhabit this vast, unbelievably vast universe. How on earth could we possibly know what is going on in galaxies, massive distances away from us with our puny little senses? We're in no position to say whether life in other planets is likely or unlikely, probable or improbable. What an impertinence, okay? We're simply not in a position to do that. There's such a big gap between us and what we're trying to know about the universe as a whole, is that we're going well beyond what we are capable of pronouncing upon. And so this is a similar idea here with God and evil. We're just so ignorant of the world as a whole. How could we possibly know that there aren't greater goods, which, atheists pushing evidential version of argument have given some famous examples. One of the most famous is the fawn that dies in a forest fire. What possible good is this doing? One can go on with endless number of examples which appear to be pointless, appear to be fruitless, appear to have no correlation to any kind of good, let alone a greater one. But how do we know? Perhaps there is something there that we just can't see, but God can, okay? Because he can, he's justified in permitting these evils to continue and not interfering. Okay, that's this central idea of skeptical theism. Now, I want to take the skeptical theist idea, developed in the context of arguing about greater goods, and apply it to the idea here of greater evils. And it can just be applied straightforwardly, just as we are to our cognitive impairment, and perhaps our cognitive corruption too, is so bad that we're in no position to discern the probability or improbability of there being greater goods necessarily associated with the evils of this world. Likewise, we're in no position to declaim on the probability or improbability of there being necessary greater evils. Okay? We're in no position to be able to say that the greater evil scenario, okay, the idea that for every good there is a necessarily or logically connected greater evil, we're in no position to say that that hypothesis is unlikely. Thus, the atheist avoids the theist avoids the anti-theodical objection to and counters the evidential argument from evil. Okay, so you combine the move about greater evils with that's the move made by the you combine that move, the theist in defense of God can put together the appeal to greater evils to get around the moral objection that the anti-theodicist makes to greater goods, and then combine that with skeptical theism to get around the kind of epistemic objection which says, well, we just don't, it's just so unlikely that there are these greater evils. Where are they, for heaven's sake, and so on. Okay. Now I want to look at skeptical theism in a critical light now, and first in relation to the logical argument from evil. As I say, it's not normally discussed in the context of the evidential argument, but I want to have a look for a moment, just briefly, at how it fares in the context of the logical argument from evil and how it can be applied there. Because one might wonder, okay, in the case of greater evils, and there being a logical connection between lesser evils and greater evils, unlike the case of a logical connection between lesser evils and greater goods, one might wonder in this case of greater evils whether there can be a logical connection between lesser evils and greater evils, whether the greater evil scenario is even a logical possibility. Now we can see as I say, we can see the logical connection between evils and greater goods. This is just the idea. Fortitude requires suffering. Forgiveness needs someone to have committed an offence, and so forth and so on. But there doesn't seem to be anything like that. No example like that we can point to. No plausible looking logical connection we can point to. None that I've been able to think of. Just what is this logical connection between lesser evils and greater evils? There may certainly be empirical connections, okay. But what would the logical connection be? Okay. But here, the skeptical theist can perhaps reapply their skepticism. They might argue that just as our cognitive powers are not up to the task of discerning the existence of greater goods, so too, justifying greater goods, so too or being able to say whether such goods are likely or not, equally, our cognitive powers are not up to the task of discerning all the logical relations in the universe, and particularly logical relations between lesser evils and greater evils. We just can't rule it out either as logically important. We just can't rule this out as that there are no such logical relations. We don't know all the logical relations. Look at mathematics. Look how long it took us to discover all sorts of mathematical connect, and how many other mathematical truths out there that we haven't discovered and will never get discovered, never get anywhere near discovering. Okay, or maybe it's like that with connection between lesser evils and greater evils. Now to this, I'm going to postpone my reply, okay, because the reply that I would give, which is a reply, if you like, in terms of our entitlement, indeed more than our entitlement, really the necessity of our accepting the appearances of things. I want to say that this is, that's the reply I'm going to give in the case of the evidential argument. And so what I'm just going to say here is that what I'm about to say in a minute about the evidential argument, I would simply apply back here. And I'll leave that as an exercise for the viewer or the listener to go through for themselves. But I think if you can grasp what I'm saying about the evidential argument, whether you agree with me or not, you can see how it could be applied in the same way to this argument about knowing there being logical connections, or being able to, or whether or not there are logical connections. Okay, and again, there's some other possibilities here but I, again, for reasons of time, I think we can skip over those and let's get to the evidential argument. Okay, skeptical theism and the evidential argument. Skeptical theism is, I suggest, although it often advertises its humility, I think that it's really guilty of a kind of false modesty. Certainly we are not omniscient, no doubt about that, but we grasp more than skeptical theism supposes. Now, to bring out the point here, I want to begin with a human case, and I take my example from Alex O'Connor, the well-known atheist YouTuber at the channel Cosmic Skeptic. And in this video from a year or so ago, he is talking about his a friend, an imaginary friend, and he's talking about context of skeptical theism, and he listen to what he has to say. Here it comes.
If somebody murdered a close friend of mine in cold blood and stole his wallet right in front of me, I couldn't logically rule out the possibility that my friend was some undercover political saboteur whose assassination prevented him from committing a war crime against the United Kingdom, and there was national security secrets in his wallet, and so the assassin actually did a good thing. Sure, that's not logically impossible, I can't rule that out, but not only would it be difficult to entertain this hypothesis as I watched my friend bleeding out on the floor, I'd also be somewhat troubled by anyone who tried to argue that it might be a good thing that my friend was murdered because of this reason, and that if I want to mourn his sadness, if I want to mourn him in sadness, if I want to say that's a bad thing, then I'd better be able to demonstrate that his death is logically incompatible with the theory of a benevolent assassin. I don't think that that would be my burden in that situation.
Before I can comment on this, we do need to make one small adjustment to what Alex says here, to make it applicable to the context of an evidential argument from evil. In that context, Alex is not expected to show, as he seems to assume here, that the scenario of his friend being a terrorist taken out by a benevolent assassin, he does not need to show that that is a logical impossibility. And a lucky thing that he doesn't need to show that, because obviously it's not a logical impossibility. Rather, the skeptical theist will insist that he does need to show that the hypothesis, the scenario, is unlikely, okay? And then the skeptical theist contends that our limited cognitive powers leave us no right to say that this is unlikely. Well, Alex disagrees. Looking at the whole context of the discussion, I think the way Alex would put it, and it is a very natural way to put it, and I wouldn't say categorically wrong to put it this way, but what I think he would say is that the terrorist benevolent assassin theory is highly improbable. Now, I can't go into sufficient depth about this here, but I'm going to suggest that this is potentially misleading. In a moment, I'm going to suggest that this is liable to be, can mislead us if we're not careful. But whether Alex, I'll come to that in a moment, but whether Alex would say precisely this, whether he would talk about probability, about it being improbable here, he certainly does this. He takes the stand of just summarily dismissing the scenario without consideration, okay? In the way you would do with a logical impossibility. And that stand seems to me to be absolutely justified. Alex just does not so much as countenance the possibility that his friend was somehow involved in this far-fetched theory. His attitude and his tone is not merely skeptical or doubtful, it is dismissive, even indignant and derisive. It is, of course, tempting to think that this attitude, if it is to be justified, must be based on a proper appraisal of all the evidence. Who wouldn't base their beliefs upon the evidence, we might say? Do you ignore the evidence? Well, I think that in cases like this, cases dealing with beliefs that are very deep and fundamental to our epistemic structures, there's a real risk of being misleading. I want to say that in a case like this, there is no evidence, no reason at all in support of this preposterous theory that his friend was a terrorist. And that therefore, that's point one, and therefore point two, Alex grasped immediately that there was such a lack of evidence. And, this is the crucial thing, he did not, because he had no reason to, open his mind to consider the matter and then close it again on the basis of evidence. He does not even, for example, he does not even ask to see the wallet, to see if it can, of his friend's wallet, to see if it contains national security papers. He just dismisses the thought without any consideration. Or in fact, of course, in reality, he wouldn't even have to dismiss the thought because the thought would never occur to him. Okay? And even in many cases where it did occur to him, if someone were to wander up to him and say, hey, I think your buddy there, I saw him planting a bomb, no, okay? He's known this guy all his life. Of course he's not a terrorist, okay? That person's a crank. He just dismisses the idea. Now, of course, it is a logical possibility that the outlandish idea is true. But more than that, okay, it's also an empirical possibility. And because it is a logical and empirical possibility, there are very rare occasions on which people are caught out, okay? I mean, Alex, could end up with mud on his face. It turns out his friend, his friend really was a terrorist. But 99.9 recurring percent of the time, that's not what happens. And the fact that it does very rarely happen does not make Alex's dogmatism, and it is a kind of dogmatism, irrational. Not sometimes, heaven's sake, often, indeed more than often, keeping your mind shut is not just the right thing to do, it's an epistemic necessity. The mere fact that a theory is a logical or an empirical possibility doesn't mean we should open our minds to it. In fact, it rarely even occurs to us to open our minds to all sorts of empirical possibilities. And such dogmatism is an essential and structural feature of our lives. We could not survive on this earth for half an hour if, in normal circumstances, we kept stopping to check if the next bit of ground in front of us would hold our weight, whether the next person to pass us in the street might be about to murder us, whether the next morsel of food bought from the supermarket might be poisonous, or worrying whether the sun will rise in the morning. We have a word for people who are like this. Paranoid, okay? And they are a model of irrationality. Now, and it's important to see that this dogmatism, and this is why I'm calling it dogmatism, is that it's not based on evidence. In these kinds of cases, cases concerning our most fundamental assumptions about how the word works, we have not weighed the evidence for and against the chances of the people in the street attacking us. As I said, trying to do that would be a disaster. We just push ahead without thinking about it. It never enters our head, consciously or unconsciously. There is no time at which we opened our minds to the outlandish idea, not even a wee bit, and then, after that, assessing the evidence and dismissing it. And so it is with Alex and his friend. What positive evidence does Alex have that his friend was not a terrorist? Like his friend, for example, telling him, "Alex, I'm not a terrorist, okay? Ex hypothesi none, okay?" The story included no such evidence. Alex takes the stand he does not because he has evidence that his friend was not a terrorist. It's because he has no evidence, zero evidence, no reason to think that his friend was a terrorist. And this is important. I can't go into every objection here. I know I'm not going to convince people who are not already on my side. Very unlikely I will. Maybe I'll get some people who haven't decided to think about it. And you know, if I was writing a full academic paper on it, obviously I would have to go into much greater depth and consider various objections. But here I'm just trying to convey the general idea. None of this is to say that Alex should never open his mind to the possibility his friend is a terrorist. He should do this when he has evidence for it. When, for example, he sees his friend pull out a gun and shoot someone. We should doubt when we have a reason to doubt. That is the sensible epistemic rule, and one that everyone except the paranoid do in fact live by, whatever lip service they may give to slogans like "question everything" or "base everything upon reason and evidence." I mean, you hear philosophers say these things. They're truly ridiculous pieces of advice. Outside the highly artificial environment of the philosophy seminar room, we rightly do not pursue doubt just for the sake of it. If I wake up in a hospital bed, drowsy from the anaesthetic administered for the emergency operation I had following a calamitous car accident, and I look down the bed and I see the outline of just one leg under the blanket, I have some reason to wonder if I still have the other one. Perhaps it had to be amputated. In these circumstances, I have a reason to doubt that I have two legs. But not as I sit here now, typing on my laptop. Not even if someone enters the room to tell me so. The hospital case is a very unusual circumstance. Yeah, perhaps not in a war zone, but for most of us, it's an unusual circumstance. Normally, I have no such reason to doubt that I have two legs. Interestingly and importantly, I do not in normal circumstances believe that I have two legs on the basis of evidence. So the problem here isn't just practical, it's logical. What evidence would there be that I have two legs? The evidence that I see the two legs with my two eyes? But as Wittgenstein, one of the most important philosophers to have thought about this matter, pointed out, I might just as well say that since I have two legs, the fact that I can see them shows that my eyesight is good. The truth is that both things, that I have two legs and that I have two good eyes, are too deep in my epistemic structure for one to support the other, for either to support the other. So the problem is not merely the practical one that our lives would become unlivable, or that there are not enough hours in the day or days in a lifetime to hunt down every logical possibility with evidence, though of course that is true, every logical or empirical possibility with evidence. The basic problem is logical, I keep saying, logical and not practical. If you can bring yourself to believe that your friend, whom you have known for so long, was really a terrorist, then, if you were consistent in your skepticism, you would have to doubt just about everything else. And that is not a coherent notion. When everything is open to doubt, nothing can ever be established. For every time you appeal to one thing to justify something else, the first thing, being equally dubious, just gives way. progress can only be made if some things are not doubtful, some things are not open to debate and discussion, some things are not in need of supporting reasons and justifications. That doesn't mean there aren't other ways of talking about them, by the way, but that's another issue. To call these basic things beliefs is already arguably misleading insofar as it suggests that these platitudes are a matter of opinion or speculation or doubt and evidence. Wittgenstein called them certainties, and all our doubting and weighing of evidence occurs against a background of such certainties, things that are, while nevertheless contingent, not matters of doubt, not matters of debate, evidence, proof, and so on. These certainties are the background which set the canons of evidence, probability and so forth, that make it possible to make assessments of probabilities in non-certain matters. For example, given the certainties about my senses, about human behaviour and so on, I can make assessments about the likely way someone I know will behave in some circumstance. Weighing of evidence, reasoning, etc. take place inside the epistemic structure resting on those certainties, but it breaks down when we try to apply it to those certainties themselves, and that application is a fantasy. It is certainty which creates rational doubt, not doubt which leads us to certainty, as Descartes thought. Descartes was wrong. Okay, so there's the human case. Alex O'Connor's example of his non-terroristic, unfortunately murdered friend. Now let's look at the divine case. Let's compare this to the case of God and evil. Skeptical theism, as I have introduced it, says that for all we know, when a lesser evil is prevented, a greater evil necessarily occurs in its stead. The greater evil scenario, as I'm calling it. We know so little, our cognitive capacities are so puny, that we cannot even say this is less likely than not, let alone rule it out completely. For all we can tell, the greater evil scenario is not unlikely. And so the evidential version of the atheist's argument from evil fails. But what reason do we have to think our powers are so limited? Remembering the lesson from the human case just explained, what reason do we have to doubt the appearances, to doubt that things are as they appear to be? For it certainly looks, in the overwhelming majority of cases, like there is no connection at all, let alone a logical one, between lesser evils and greater evils. No connection of the relevant sort, anyway. Now, if we assume that in order to be warranted in rejecting the greater evil scenario, we need positive evidence against it, then the skeptical theist will indeed seem to have a point. For there is no positive evidence against the greater evil hypothesis, just as there is none against the terrorist hypothesis in the case of Alex's friend. In both cases, there is just an absence of any reason to think either hypothesis is true, and no reason to think things are not as they appear to be. But if, as I have just argued, Alex is justified in accepting the appearances, indeed, so more than that, it's actually a necessity to do so. But anyway, if his whole epistemic world is not to collapse, but anyway, if he's justified in accepting the appearances at least, then why are we not so justified in the case of lesser evils and greater evils? Simply accepting the fact that, as it appears, okay, there simply aren't these greater evils, these necessarily logically connected greater evils. I strongly suspect that the mistaken epistemological assumption that somehow the onus of proof is on the person who rejects the greater evil or the terrorist hypothesis, rather than on those who want us to entertain it, which drives the skeptical theist argument. The true situation is that we are perfectly warranted in simply accepting the appearances unless some reason emerges to doubt them. The upshot is that in both the logical and evidential version of the argument from evil, the atheist is perfectly entitled to his premise that there are cases of evil sans the necessarily connected greater good or greater evil. Just as Alex is entitled to the assumption that his friend is not a terrorist, and I am entitled to not doubt that I have 2 arms, 2 legs and a head, and that my mother never murdered anyone, even though neither of us has any evidence for these things only the absence of any evidence. Even though neither of us has any evidence for those assumptions, okay, we only have an absence of evidence against them, an absence of evidence that his friend was a terrorist, etc. Okay, well, the theist may attempt a rejoinder here. He may argue thus, stressing the distance between God and man. But I don't think it will work. I think it is no help to point out that God's knowledge and understanding far exceed our own. After all, the question is not a relative one about his knowledge versus our own, but whether we know or are justified in accepting that things are as they seem. I've argued that we are. There is no need to bring God in, or a supercomputer, or anything else superior to us into this question. However, it might be suggested that perhaps the logically necessary connection between lesser evils and God and greater evils holds only in the case of God. Okay, that's when God, okay, prevents, a lesser evil, then necessarily a greater evil will take its place. But when we do, that doesn't happen. Okay. If this is so, then though the appearances are veridical in the human case, they are not veridical in God's case. And this has the advantage of explaining why we can be, and this has an advantage because it can explain why it is that are not only permitted to not only permitted to prevent evils, okay, but are required to, but God is not. So God gets off the hook and we don't, which seems the right outcome for the theist. Now here, the vast difference in knowledge and understanding between God and man is relevant. In particular, we might say God knows more about himself and what necessities he's subject to than we do. Well, this line of thinking could be applied to both the logical version of the argument from evil and the evidential. And it's a hard move to counter definitively, although I do think it looks pretty gratuitous. One can counterpoise to it the point that God's superior knowledge and understanding, and more so his superior power, argue the opposite way, that it is less likely in his case that there should be a necessary link between lesser evils and greater evils. He is much better equipped to ensure that preventing evils will not come back to bite us in the form of a greater evil. The scandal of theodicy. There is no immodesty in accepting the appearances. It is not immodest to take things at face value. If anything, it is humble to accept the appearances. It is thinking you see through them that might be said to smack of hubris. Which brings me to my most important point, which is a moral one. I mentioned in discussing the case of Alex's friend that Alex responded not merely with skepticism, but with dismissiveness, and even a touch of indignant derision. He said, "I would be somewhat troubled by anyone who tried to argue that it might be a good thing that my friend was murdered because of this reason, namely as being a terrorist, and that if I want to mourn him in sadness, if I want to say that it is a bad thing that he was murdered, then I'd better be able to demonstrate that his death is logically incompatible with the theory of a benevolent assassin. I don't think that that would be my burden in that situation." Again, I assume that the point and the tone stand when we alter his words to say that the benevolent assassin theory is simply to be dismissed, even though it is both the logical and empirical possibility. I take his implicit thought to be something like this: how dare you make up far-fetched stories about my friend's life in order to excuse letting him be murdered, or indeed to excuse murdering him in this case. A corresponding thought is implicit in my criticism of the greater evil scenario, and indeed of mainstream greater good theology and conventional skeptical theism at large. One can imagine Ivan Karamazov thundering, "How dare you make up far-fetched stories to justify letting children suffer?" Okay, I quickly want to well, perhaps I won't. I might leave this out. I was going to say something about skeptical theism, a moral version of skeptical theism. But I think this is the idea that there might be some moral notion, some kind of good, where the question of the issue is not whether the good exists or whether it's necessarily connected to, but whether or not we are even capable of recognizing it as a good, or recognizing it as having morally, being a morally sufficient reason or something like that. That's a discussion in its own right. I'm not impressed by that line of thinking, as you wouldn't be very surprised to learn, but I think for reasons of time, so this is already long enough. Okay. Skeptical theism redux. I've been pretty severe on skeptical theism, as I've been on theodicy generally. But for all that, okay, I do believe that skeptical theists are actually onto something, albeit in a disfigured kind of form. And in a future video, I'm not sure if it'll be the next one or not yet, but certainly in the future one, I hope to explore what I think is a more promising and ultimately a more genuinely humble form of skeptical theism. Anyway, okay, look, that's it. I think I've gotten out the main points here. I hope it was clear, and I hope that you find it interesting, and I'll be interested in hearing your views. Anyway, okay, I'll see you next time. Cheers.